Hi everyone, and welcome to this session. I think probably my most personal lecture, to date. I think we're going to tackle today something I've felt discomfort surrounding for quite a while, which is I started a career within occupational psychology hoping to do good. That's I think what drives many of us is doing good in the world and providing help. And I think this contrasted with what I saw occupational psychology being most kind of commonly espoused to be, which was about performance, about efficiency, about organizational outcomes, rather than thinking about the people, the work, their well-being, the communities and the societies, and making that fair and balanced and fit for purpose. And so this presentation has come off some of these sorts of ideas, where we're going to cover the historical values of occupational psychology, what's been gone to bring us to this moment in time, but also the things that probably are quite important that we can, could, should address. And I'm hoping by the end of this session, we're going to leave you with a point to reflect of, what do you want? What's the point of all of this? Would you prefer more creatures, or do you want more creature comforts? So let's get stuck in. So we'll kick off with the kind of historical background to occupational psychology, and it starts with psychology. But first, let's tackle one of the core issues around this field. We have lots of different names for ourselves. So if you're in the UK, you probably know the term occupational psychology. If you're in the US, you probably know IO psychology, which stands for industrial organizational. I'm sort of referring to this whole group of study within this talk today, so please forgive me if I spin from one to the other. I'm referring to the same sort of thing. And this field was set up initially as an applied branch of psychology. Now, psychology obviously started off with things like behaviorism, and then we had psychoanalysis, and the kind of third wave of psychology was this humanistic perspective, where we acknowledged that hopefully we have free will, we're capable of introspection and questioning ourselves, and hopefully, I think, aiming towards self-actualization, where all is good. And so occupational psychology started within that, when individuals started to see the benefit of psychological theories and ideas and principles for the real world in terms of organizations, structures, and teams. And I think this was most popularly seen during the First World War and during the Second, where occupational psychology played a really critical role in supporting nations to be way more efficient when they were working with limited resources. Obviously, during the war, puts a constraint on things. We need to be effective and efficient. And occupational psychologists played a key kind of critical role in facilitating a number of new practices, including what probably you would have been first referred to when studying occupational psychology, which was things like psychometrics, and the famous case where we were able to allocate different individuals within an army to different roles based on how they performed in these sorts of tests. So let's stop. Let's have a quick reflect. Name a famous occupational psychologist. So when you go occupational psychology, who do you think of? What do they look like? What are they? Who are they? If you can name more than one, great. Let's hear them. What you probably will find, if you think beyond your immediate group, so people on teaching a program, or me, or whoever, you'll probably think of people that are male, that are white, that are based in the UK or US, and probably they have interesting moustaches or facial hair. You don't need to comment on mine. I'm aware of my own limitations. This question, I guess, is to encourage us to reflect on where we have come from as a discipline. And the vast majority of work produced in this domain has been from the US and the UK by privileged white males that just so happen to have interesting facial hair. And I think these provide the setting, the context for where we are now. And so what we're going to do is we're going to very quickly recap a few of these, not necessarily to glamorize or promote the work that they did, but to recognize that in playing their role, we now have to deal with certain other factors in play. Let's get started. The first person to talk about is probably Munsterberg. They are famous for being the father, as it were, of industrial psychology. And this was on the basis that he was one of the first individuals to say, look, psychology has a lot to offer. Psychology could be helpful within organizations. So he started suggesting many different applications of psychological principles within business. So things like looking at management, job performance, motivation. And critically, he suggested that we should be recruiting people based on personality traits, the mental abilities that are required for the work. So basically, we could match people to roles to increase efficiency. We could be super efficient if we matched everybody to what was best suited for them. He had lots of interesting views. He was German. He thought generally that Americans floated between jobs, and he thought maybe if the skills were more aligned, then perhaps they'd be more motivated to do so. He received a lot of critique for these sorts of ideas. He wrote a couple of books saying not particularly nice things about Americans, including that they had a quote-unquote general inability to concentrate their attention on any one thing for very long. I'm sure he'd be horrified at our social media-based culture that we have right now, I'm sure. He also suggested women shouldn't be allowed to serve on juries because they were incapable of rational deliberation. But there we go. So he had a very strong view that psychology had lots to offer within the domain of business, and I think hopefully we all agree, and this is what kind of kicked off quite a few different developments in this space. Frederick Taylor, our second example of privileged white male, was another kind of early adopter of psychological principles within business, and he's particularly known for what's called scientific management or Taylorism, and it's in essence a drive for efficiency within workplaces, and it consisted of kind of four core things. So he wanted to replace rule of thumb work methods with methods based on a scientific study of the tasks, and this is where time and motion studies kicked off, which was where they would watch what exactly was required of a specific job over time and break it down into its smallest components so they could question exactly how it could be made super efficient. He also promoted scientifically selecting, training, and developing each employee rather than going for this more kind of organic training themselves or learning on the job. He encouraged to provide detailed instruction and supervision of each worker in the performance of that person's discrete task. And interestingly, he also encouraged people to divide work equally between managers and workers so that managers apply the scientific management principles to planning the work, and so then the actual workers actually do that job. He was a very interesting man. He had lots of skills. He was a very good tennis player. He also came fourth in the 1900 Summer Olympics in golf. So clearly his attention to detail and disciplined focus was helpful when applied elsewhere. But broadly speaking, he helped us to encourage us to think around human factors and things like the interaction between humans and machines and how we can break down different tasks to be efficient. And really widely promoted, to this day is still discussed, not uncritically, but his scientific management principles have been widely adopted and discussed. Clearly very influential. So one more privileged white male for you, this time Eldon Mayo, not the type of source. Most people, when they think of occupational psychology, think of the Hawthorne studies, and they broadly speaking, they looked at how managers' changing of things, so attention, work environments, things like that, could change work outcomes. Most people know it because essentially the most commonly kind of anecdotally reported thing is that they dimmed down the lights, performance improved. They boosted the lights back to normal, performance improved again. And from that sort of general principle, the Hawthorne effect is now well studied, and essentially it's people behave differently when they're observed because of the attention and the dynamics within that. Now, it wasn't all about lights, the original Hawthorne studies. They did lots of things. So the amount of attention they got from managers, they manipulated. They cleaned everybody's workstations. They cleared floors of obstacles. They relocated workstations, etc., etc. But broadly speaking, they found that if you paid attention to somebody, they generally performed a bit better. Now, one would hope that the conclusion there is take care of people and pay attention to them and value what they do, and you'll be great. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. But what these Hawthorne studies did do is they increased our attention to the kind of human, social, and political things going around. And in particular, Mayo emphasised the importance of employee well-being, motivation, and engagement. And from this came much greater interest in things like organisational behaviour, or what's known as OB, and human relations. So he was really influential in promoting these ideas, so that individuals didn't think of people like cogs in the machine, but could be treated like humans. And so what do we need to do to treat them as a human to improve their outputs? So those are three very, very important kind of historical figures within occupational psychology that you can see already just through our conversation thus far has led us to some extent to where we are today. So the people have been influential, but what about the context? I think this is something that's really niggled at me quite a lot when we look at the development of different professions and fields. We don't really recognise the wider context, and something I'd like to talk very briefly about today is the economic context. Occupational psychology has originated, it's thrived in regions with capitalist and neoliberalist economic systems. I know not everybody's familiar with what these words mean, and they can be politicized and cause anxiety. So I'm going to kind of spell out a few kind of core components of each and show where OcPsych has originated from these. So firstly, capitalism. It's our current economic system, and it basically means most of the means of production are privately owned, and that there is a general drive for continued growth to deliver profit. That's the primary objective. And capitalism, more broadly, has remained a taboo despite the kind of societal impact that it has upon all of us. And it's really easy for us to see the role of occupational psychology when we acknowledge that organizations are driven by profit motive and competitive advantage, if we consider supply and demand models, for example. And so it's really easy to see why occupational psychology was so helpful, because it allowed us to give organizations competitive advantage. So a great example here was, the development of psychometrics to allocate army trainees to the different roles. Clearly, we gave our country a benefit by being able to more effectively allocate resources. So that's one core component. The second is neoliberalist philosophy, and that's basically they endorse capitalism, but it has an emphasis on economic liberalism. So that basically means freedom from government regulation, and it encourages, typically you see within neoliberalist philosophies, a lot of privatization of the private sector. So neoliberalism is a dominant ideology in Western societies, and it has been expanding beyond that. And it also has had a substantive impact upon occupational psychology through the sort of values, priorities, and decisions that are made. Okay, and some of these are highlighted below in terms of what we look at, the types of work structures we look at, the types of practices we deem acceptable for us to use. And across these, neoliberal values highlighting the kind of individual and the competitive nature of work are evidence. And I find this really weird because despite this kind of massive ideological influence, capitalism, neoliberalism is basically almost never discussed, taught, challenged. And I didn't see any of this in any of my study, or indeed previously was in any of my programs I taught. And I question why that might be. It may be because occupational psychologists claim to be interested in the individual most, rather than the wider societal structures. So it could be just that we're interested a lot in the individual. It could be because the mechanisms by which an ideology can influence an individual is hard to establish. Right? They're connected, but it's hard to measure things and to really kind of capture that effectively. Or perhaps it's because we as Oc-Psychs take for granted, or at least do not fundamentally question, the broader socio-economic systems in which we work. We just don't. And Lefkowitz has argued previously that the values represented by the practitioner portion of the scientist-practitioner model in occupational psychology has been dominated by the business values of an idealized free market capitalism. And this can be seen throughout the whole system of work within occupational psychology. And I'm going to give you just one example of publishing. So I'm quite passionate about academic publishing. I think it's really important that researchers promote their work and disseminate it in structured and efficient ways. And so academic publishers are one kind of route to that. So what happens is I, as a researcher, do a lot of hard work, write up a study or studies, and submit it to a journal for consideration. That journal will then send it to some of my peers, who will peer review it for free. They send the feedback to me, they make a decision as to whether eventually they publish or choose not to publish my work. If they agree to publish it, I sometimes might be asked to pay an article processing charge, or an APC. And sometimes, not always, both of them, the reader, the eventual audience for the scientific work, will also be asked to pay to access the work. So often this is through librarians and folk within institutions, but can be on an individual basis too. Now, capitalism influences this whole process and indeed the whole scientific ecosystem, and in my view, quite problematically. Within this economic system, within capitalism, what do businesses want to do? They want to make money. They want to make profit. They are profit driven. And you can see here the profit margins for scholarly publishing. The biggest publishers like Springer, Elsevier and such have some of the highest profit margins seen in businesses. And this is compared to places like Google and Apple, which are known to be extremely profitable. So they're profit driven. What implication is that? So within their general day-to-day business, that means they want people to buy papers. So they want people to buy the journals. They want people to read it, to cite it, to make it look like it is. They are publishing great, so they have reputational gains. So more people buy and want to publish there and pay the article processing charges. And then the more papers they have, the more they are able to sell on to others, etc., etc., etc. And to do that, they kind of demand these sorts of things like important papers, novel papers, clear papers, stuff that looks sexy, stuff that looks like it would be really exciting and get a lot of interest. Because if they get a lot of interest, people will pay to access it. What does that also mean? If they are profit driven, they are subsequently interested in not spending too much. And that has implications for quality control. So they don't spend any money on quality control as it stands. Peer review is done by peers, me and you. It's part of my job expectations is that I do kind of community-based work, and part of that is likely that I would spend time reviewing, or indeed being an editor, also mostly unpaid work. And what does that mean then for kind of all these other aspects of their work? Well, it says keep articles short. So we don't need loads of methodological detail, because that increases the likelihood of there being errors. And in the historic features, journals would be published in paper, so that would be more paper to publish to print. So it would be the benefit would be keep it short and concise. Obviously, not always the best thing for science, because we want detail. We want to know the in-depth nuance of everything that's done, so we can replicate it, so we can reproduce it, so we can build upon it. But also, don't spend lots of time reviewing things, fact-checking, because that takes time, that takes people's effort, that takes money. So within this kind of capitalist framework, academic publishing is quite problematic because it emphasizes the wrong sort of incentives, that is to do things that are going to be surprising and sexy. Don't write about them in lots of detail, and don't pay lots of attention to quality and checking it and reproducing it. And so capitalism has had this kind of effect throughout our scientific infrastructure, where these sorts of incentives have been distorted based on this business model. And there's lots of different ways in which the effects of capitalism can be seen across all the different kind of domains within which occupational psychology work. Very briefly, lots of people might say, well, Tom, it's capitalism and that's, just live with it, deal with it. Fair comment. What we should also do, however, is acknowledge that there are alternative systems, frameworks. We're going to cover degrowth in just a second, but I thought it might be useful to cover something like this, which is the donut economic system developed by Kate Raworth. And she talks about negotiating economics by balancing the needs of people, so that we need food and shelter and water and all these, core things to exist. But we also need to balance that with the ecological ceiling of Earth and its limits, right? Because unless we find another planet, I don't think we will within the time frame at which climate change is catching up to us. There are limits. So ocean acidification is a real problem. Freshwater withdrawals. We have air pollution. All these sorts of things. And it's a whole basically ecosystem that shows us there's a kind of a space in which we can work within the donut, as it were, where we have to work out how can we fulfill these needs whilst not going too far as to pushing the kind of ecological boundaries of what's possible. This, I think, is quite hard to do, but there are models out here to show that these things should be considered and can be considered. So whilst capitalism is what we're working with, there are alternatives, and I think it was important to raise these as potentials. So let's get back to occupational psychology. Occupational psychology, if I'm honest, has had a historic trend of identity being questioned. What are we? Who are we? What are we doing? What's our role? And similarly, how do we differentiate ourselves from any other professional community? And there's been lots of research in this sort of domain, and a lot of it suggests that it's on these sorts of factors you can see on the screen, that we are scientific and we are evidence-based. We often describe ourselves, or occupational psychologists, using scientific evidence and theory to help organizations make better decisions, more effective interventions, whatever that might be. And within this context, it becomes quite hard to maintain the kind of employee-centric perspective and to indeed advocate for employees when the priorities of employees and employers aren't really well aligned. And let's be honest, we're working within capitalism. They want to pay workers as little as possible. Workers want to be paid as much as possible. And so there is this conflict. And so to avoid being kind of unscientific or kind of siding with one way or another, we tend to focus on factors that can be really objectively measured. And they tend to be measured by management. So things like performance and effectiveness. So what we often do is, despite there being a kind of humanistic framework and basis for psychology, we've detoured a little bit from that, it's fair to say. We claim to want to help people. And often when people talk about why they go into occupational psychology, they talk about it because they want to help people, help their working lives and things like that. But we also need to recognize that we might also be doing more harm than good if we're hiding our ideologies under the guise of science or evidence-based practice. Historically, we have basically declared ourselves as being value-free. And compared to lots of other disciplines within psychology, we've been kind of less committed, as it were, historically to explicitly political or social theoretical issues. A great example of this, Munsterberg, I spoke about him earlier. He encouraged us, quote unquote, to not get entangled within the economic discussions of the day, focusing on the means but not the ends. And this is seen throughout it. So if we look at what we study, how we study it, injustice and unethical behaviour are really common themes of study, but we don't often tend to see active intervention or advocating for individuals within this space. We don't see the necessary components to promote workplace justice. We often see it as people kind of using these as broad themes to then look at outcomes which are of desire to management, performance, etc. And occupational psychologists work within a wide range of these value-laden concepts. For example, what makes something fair? We often defer to our organisations to determine our answers. And as such, we can't ever claim to be value-free. We're shaped by the economic values of our professional practice. In attempting to be scientific and objective and rigorous and evidence-based, Lefkowitz argues we've created this sort of moral vacuum into which economic or economically driven corporate values have flowed, we've welcomed them, and yet we're not acknowledging that these are the values that we have. We're using these to disguise, to hide our ideology. We're just saying we're just following the evidence. We're just doing what the science tells us is right. Well, if we do that, we're missing actually on all these other wider factors that we need to consider, including our morals, including our values. What are they? What do we stand for? If we stand for the organization's priorities, then who do we become? So just in case you want a counterpoint, if you disagree that science is value-free, let's consider the field of scientific racism. So this is where researchers have used science to classify people into different groups, and it's often on the boundaries of race or skin color, and then established that some are more superior than others, claim that those things are important, and then suggest often eugenics, right? Improving the genetic quality of the human species by removing those deemed inferior. So those with disabilities, those with darker skin, etc., etc. And whether that be through sterilization or selective breeding, whatever it might be, people have conducted this sort of research, correlating skin color and IQ or intelligence, for a reason. This is not an innocent question. There is a motive behind why the research has been conducted. There has been a purpose, a drive, a point to it. And that point in this particular case is racism. And so if we claim we are value-free, we're denying that these things are possible, that we are capable of doing science for a reason, for a particular purpose, and that sometimes that purpose can be good, bad, or otherwise. I think it's really important to recognize that what we do is not objective, it's not evidence-based, it's not value-free. We are individuals who are making interpretations of things, making recommendations or suggestions or claims based on our interpretations of evidence. So moving away from those ideas for the time, occupational psychology has started off with good intentions, with these humanistic social justice values, trying to do the good thing, for example, helping fight the war. Over the years, then, our identity, I think, has become more confused as we've increasingly focused on supporting organizational outcomes rather than the original focus of occupational psychology, which was to ensure that workplaces are safe, are just, are healthy, challenging, fulfilling places to work. And it's been argued that in comparison with academic social science, we don't just study organizations, do we? We're helping them, which, based on businesses' moral justification, is a real positive. It's a good thing. Yet, Lefkowitz argues the moral price we pay for being useful and handsomely rewarded is our silence in the face of the indictments described and the co-optation of our humanistic values. He was quite a provocative author. He argues if we justifiably take credit for our contributions to the societal goods attributed to those corporations, aka we've made them more efficient, we've made them more plentiful, great, should we not also own up to some complicity in the harms that they commit? In some instances, we are more actively culpable regarding certain HR policies and decisions. More importantly, we should assume the role of actively challenging those decisions by engaging the system. I think this is a really interesting point, right? If we help an organization be more successful, we're happy to take the credit. But are we also able to recognize the potential harms that have happened through those, particularly when we seem to have such great influence in kind of HR policies and these sorts of domains? Now, when I look at the literature in occupational psychology as a whole, the clear managerialist sort of bias within our work is evident simply in the outcomes we look at, those of priorities to management. And annoyingly, really annoys me, even when we capture worker-focused outcomes, it tends to be justified on the basis that it facilitates those other organizational outcomes. So we go, oh, it's really important that people are happy and healthy at work. Because when they're happy and healthy at work, they are productive, efficient members of staff. We sort of don't need to do that second jump. We can sort of accept that we're doing good just for the purposes of making people happier and healthier. And Ball et al. Has argued that productivity and other business or performance-related outcomes should not be prioritized as the ultimate and unquestionable goals of our research. It shows we've deviated. Somewhere along the lines, our foundations, our values have somewhat shifted somewhere. Some have claimed that this has made us handmaidens to corporate or managerial concerns, and that we've slowly started to become ignorant and paying any attention to the power differences between workers and managers and how these sorts of struggles drive inequalities. And when I was thinking about this, to some extent, I feel unfortunately these have been embedded within our professional ways of working. So, for example, the BPS, which is the accrediting body within the UK for occupational psychology MSc programs, they have what's known as the consultancy cycle, as you can see on the screen here, and it places us as subservient consultants rather than value-led practitioners who dictate priorities and objectives. And it's been argued that in being hired, because a lot of occupational psychologists are hired by organizations and thus controlled, we're becoming pawns of management. We've lost our independent researcher identity and instead become workers. And it's really interesting because when I talk to occupational psychologists, just through their language, it's clear what position. They say, oh, we work with X organization. Well, we work with thingy to do this. But is it working for or working with? And I think that provides a really interesting question into the scope of our ability to dictate the values and priorities of the work we complete. Do we have scope to dramatically change things, to dictate the terms, to dictate the priorities? Are we merely following what is set out and following the structures and the processes to deliver what they ultimately want? So all this lends the question, who do we have responsibility for? Or to who we have responsibility? We as a profession have tended to emphasize the impact of individuals. And I think that was from a humanistic perspective, that we should care and look at the individual employee. But that has been at the subsequent cost of recognising and downplaying the accountability of the organisations. So Lefkowitz has argued that we tend to look at management perspectives. We misconstrue a system level attribute as an individual level construct. So we tend to look at, why is this person struggling? Why are they not able to cope? Rather than, are we making unreasonable demands? And this avoids us having to challenge management's policies and practices and distributional ideas, right? And a great example of this was raised by Lott in 2014, who looked at an influential review on workplace stress and well-being by Griffin and Clark in 2011. And they claimed that making changes to the work environment, so things like increasing pay or benefits, it just wasn't talked about. It was dismissed in one sentence as, quote unquote, not always practical or desirable. But that begs the question, to who? Not to the organisation, but to the individual. Yes, that probably would significantly help their well-being. And it's just a path of least resistance. We tend to measure individuals' qualities and behaviours because they're so much more straightforward to measure. But we miss out on kind of recognising and holding account the more nebulous workplace qualities like workplace culture or climate. And I tell you what most annoys me, the most critical example of this I can think of is in the well-being literature, where we often phrase and frame resilience as an individual's ability to cope, rather than examining the quantity or the intensity of the stresses that that person has been experiencing. This is blaming the victim, and we're part of that. We've been perpetuating that in the ways we do our work. And this just isn't in well-being domains, it's in a lot of different ideas. So there's research that's been done of the attribution of the situational causes of poverty to the characteristics and character of the individuals suffering from it. We, I think, starting off from a humanistic perspective, have responsibility towards individuals. The maintenance of their well-being should be a critical, central role of our work. But we tend to slightly miss the focus. We slightly dodge slightly and defer to the organisation. And I think this is, if we go take a step back and we look at the wider context in which we operate, there are loads of complexities in navigating this space. So one great example of this is seen in organisational climate change action. So that's typically framed as it's an individual's responsibility as to whether they do something, rather than an expectation. So, for example, I'm an academic. I want to go to a conference. I can choose to get a train, and because that's lower carbon, so it's slightly more environmentally beneficial, or slightly less harmful than a plane, I should say. I could take a day to get there. I could take a day to get back. I've lost 2 days of productivity. If I get a plane, I could get there and back on the same morning or evening or whatever. That, however, has a cost to my career, because I've lost 2 days of my life that I can't then be spending doing other things. So it's punishing me for doing what I think is important to me, right? It's an individual thing, but I'm being punished because it's not seen as a structural wider priority. And certainly in a competitive industry where many of the most valued outcomes from work are completed outside my core responsibilities. So, beyond teaching and administration, I'm also evaluated on whether I produce grants and publications and things like that. Responsible travel then is an opportunity cost. Do I want to get punished, or do I want to take the easier route? Do I want to creature comfort and gain the benefits from doing so? There's a direct conflict there. And this is seen, there was some really interesting research done on academics who who were climate researchers yet still flew for their careers despite holding negative attitudes towards flying, because they're stuck in this hyper-competitive academic system that indeed many occupational psychologists find themselves in, and to some extent can be attributed to capitalism, where we're focusing on certain priorities and profit priorities rather than perhaps others. Now, in promoting management interests, what we also do is subdue everything else. We minimize everything else. Our focus on satisfying organizational needs not only determines the nature of our professional practice, but much of our science agenda as well. Now, we hold a purposefully narrow view of what constitutes work and workers. And in championing management interests, we've been actively hostile to practices, communities, structures that represent threats to managerial interests. A great example of this is unions. They're generally understudied communities in occupational psychology. You know, when we look at, for example, when people consider different types of stakeholders, different groups, they are incredibly underrepresented. Also, and this is a kind of looking back at the history again, one of the reasons why we spoke about it at the start, is that many historical figures in our discipline have indeed been indifferent or extremely anti-union. For example, Frederick Taylor claimed unions were absolutely redundant, because if organizations employed scientific management, workers would be so effective, they would be just so effective. They would have shorter hours, they would have better compensation, so they wouldn't need to overwork, they wouldn't need to be paid pennies, because they were just so efficient and so good at what they did, things would be naturally good for them at work. Now, many have claimed historically that unions are hostile to occupational psychologists. Now, I'd question this. I'd say, is this unexpected, given our propensity to side with management interests? Great example of this, personality inventories. These were historically used to identify union sympathizers within the workforce because of the management belief that union engagement was driven by, quote unquote, delusions of conspiracy and lunacy. And this was a perspective advocated by Eldon Mayo, who we also discussed earlier. Now, I've focused here on unions, but if I'm honest, there's loads of different domains that have been purposefully ignored. So anti-work, different types of organisations that have greater social justice dimensions, so things like B Corps or cooperations. Distributive justice interventions don't tend to be adopted widely. I might question why. And precarious work. All these sorts of things, occupational psychology, it's so dramatically underrepresented. We've just failed to prioritise these things. And our focus has been distorted in such different ways. So in studying individuals, we have an evidence tendency to study only certain types of individuals. So a lot of you may be familiar with the weird bias. That is, research tends to be disproportionately covering Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic populations, popularized by the paper by Henrich et al. In 2010. Oxpsychs have their own sort of version. It's called posh bias. Now, not posh in the sort of Michelin star food posh. Posh as in a bias towards professionals, official work in the formal economy, groups safe from discrimination, and citizens of high-income countries. I think that's a bit of a stretch at trying to get the posh acronym to work. But the dominant narrative in our discipline is it shouts posh. It shouts managerial priorities. The types of samples typically captured by our field overrepresent core, salaried, managerial, professional, executive employees and completely underrepresent wage earners, low, medium skill, first-line personnel, contract workers, these sorts of things. And as such, there's a substantive range of really minoritized groups which we have failed to advocate for. We've failed to improve their working lives. So another little quiz, an opportunity to stop and reflect. What percentage of children between 5 and 17 are engaged in child labour? So this is defined as harmful work that interferes with schooling, by the way. Okay, have your number. The percentage of children between 5 and 17 across the globe engaged in child labour, harmful work that's affecting schooling, is 10%. It makes me sick. It makes me feel physically sick. I've got 2 kids in that age range, and it feels unfathomable that this would happen in the environment we have today. And then I go, okay, what has occupational psychology done about this? Okay, so there was a review of 90 years of 19 of the most prestigious occupational psychology journals. How many papers was this population discussed within? So, child labourers. How many papers? So, if we were to look at any common hot topic or theme, we'd be looking at hundreds of thousands of papers on resilience and emotional intelligence and artificial intelligence and all these sorts of things. Child labour, 17 papers, and barely any of them actually studied it. They just sort of made reference to it as an important population. 17 times. Is this what we think is important? Makes me a little bit upset. So what I have to do is question, where is our focus? And whilst we've been working within this capitalist system, I introduced the donut model earlier as well, we haven't really been focusing about alternatives. One such economic model, and it's been formalized quite a lot, is that of degrowth. And the premise is that we change growth in GDP, gross domestic product, and the subsequent infinite growth at all costs model. So broadly speaking, capitalism just assumes that there are no resource constraints, that we will continuously grow, become more profitable, grow more profitable. And degrowth tries to decenter that as the priority. And instead, it looks at what are things that we feel should be important from our values. So that people have autonomy, that there is high levels of well-being, that is collaboration, and we reduce excessive resource use. There are loads of different kind of ideas within this sort of economic system where occupational psychology could have direct and indirect impact. So direct-wise, it could be deprioritizing wage labour, implementing living wages to reduce unemployment, redistribution of paid care and volunteer work, social ecological job development, training, all these sorts of things. And indirectly, there's also a lot of other things that we can help with, right? Reducing overproduction and waste, transitioning organisations to more democratic or not-for-profit models. There's loads of things that we could do towards that, but mostly no occupational psychologists are talking about them. And I should say, now's a good time, as good a time as any, to say, whilst I've been talking about generalities across the whole field, there are obviously individuals who've been advocating for all of the different types of ideas I've been talking about today. I'm not saying that nobody's talking about it at all. I'm just saying that the balance of how well these things are represented, encouraged, discussed, acknowledged is so far off that it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And degrowth is a great example of this. We have bucket loads of potential to add skills, resources that we could help to manifest this that are currently not being discussed in any way. And it's not just capitalism that we're questioning here. It's broadly speaking, what is our focus? If it's not on child labour and it's not on degrowth, what is it on? And Kornhauser in 1947 asked, do we work on the problems of the private businessman or on the problems of society? And I think it's fair to say, based on a review of everything we've produced as a discipline thus far, we spent a disproportionate amount of time and resources on pursuing outcomes of managerial or organisational interest, and so far less on social justice and well-being. And I'm not the first to argue this. Many have already highlighted how the problems we've been addressing aren't the most socially pressing, shall we say. However, we still, as a profession, as a group, commit extensive energy on hot topics that businesses are pursuing, but few are guided by the sort of core social issues or indeed represent them within their discussions. So a great example at the moment is AI, artificial intelligence, a super hot topic. Loads of very high profile occupational psychologists are talking about it, publishing about it, LinkedIn blogging about it, because it's perceived to be changing the way people are working. At no point have they been talking about the energy and the water use of artificial intelligence and the highly localized consequences for communities that that's having. These values are just not on the radar. If you're talking about AI use, you should be looking at, okay, well, what's the consequences of that? And part of that is the environmental consequences. And it's really frustrating because most important social issues, like climate change, are within occupational psychology's ability to influence. And we saw that during COVID, right? Everybody during COVID did their very best. Occupational psychologists jumped on to try and help in whatever way they can, try and make work slightly more tolerable for, for example, pivoting onto online work and things like that. And we reflected some of our values, I think, and some of our potential in responding to the kind of social demands that COVID put upon us. Unfortunately, it also kind of showed us the other side of it, which is it reflected our current values. It focused upon the formal economy, for example, that decidedly posh bias that we have, and the priority of maintaining performance rather than tackling things like inequalities in risk, consequences for vulnerable groups within the workforce. And so what we saw was there was just this mismatch of, whilst we were trying to promote these good things or trying to be helpful, what we also did was reinforce all the misalignment in priorities and foci that we have been historically since the conception of our profession. If anybody feels passionate about this, and you might imagine I feel quite passionately about this, there are things and frameworks that we could use to help think about what our contributions could be. So decent work for all is one of the most common goals that occupational psychologists, big social goals that occupational psychologists claim to work towards, based on this model of sustainable development goals promoted by the UN, also called global goals. We could be doing loads of things. We could be supporting other core endeavours like tackling poverty, inequalities in the workplace context. We have so much to add to these big issue, big social problems, because we have those skills, we have those ways of supporting organizational change. All of these things require organizational change. They all require leadership. They all require different allocations of resources. We can do that. We can help. And so all of these areas, occupational psychology could influence the world. We could do real good. And most of the time we don't. Most of the time we try and push people to make organizations more cost effective. And I, for one, feel like that's a real missed opportunity for us as a profession to really engage with some of the biggest issues that our societies face. So on that basis, I would love for you to pause, whoever you are, student, academic, well-renowned researcher, or somebody who's just slightly inquisitive as to what OcPsych is. I'd love for you to take a moment and pause. What role do you think occupational psychology could have in tackling these social issues? What could we do, for example, about climate change? What scope do we have to change these things? So what I'm going to do is wrap things up by focusing on climate change specifically. Now I'm going to use the YPCCC's 5 facts, 10 words to ensure that we're all kind of on the same page. Climate change, it is real. It is us, aka it's anthropogenic. human caused, it's bad. Scientists agree, there is consensus that that is the case, but that there is still hope, that we have opportunities still to make things okay-ish. There's still hope. So what can we as occupational psychologists do within this sort of big societal issue? For climate change specifically, OcPsych, I think, has really great scope to make a really big impact upon, for example, awareness, action, mitigation. Now, occupational psychologists have undoubtedly contributed to the exacerbation of climate issues. We support capitalist growth ambitions in what we do, and as such, occupational psychologists have started to question whether it's now kind of our time to claim our spot at the table in coming up with solutions and sharing the skills and the insights that we have to help address this great threat. My concern being, to date, there hasn't been much coordinated action to kind of promote this as a central priority within this field. Hence why I'm writing about this and doing this. Now, one might suspect that if we were to champion social goals like environmental responsibility, it would be super popular because it reflects a unique competitive advantage, and that could lead to desirable financial outcomes for organizations, right? So we help organizations be more climate efficient. They do so, they can promote themselves as doing so, and that promotes profit. However, frustratingly, even making this argument perpetuates the current value system that organizations have to see the direct financial benefits to justify action. And indeed, it's something like, if 80 organizations in the world are doing the vast majority of the climate damage, there are things that we could do. We can provide evidence-based practices, we can demonstrate return on investment, we can help organizations solve complex human problems. We can be more. We have the tools, we have the techniques to make a difference on a much larger scale. We can do this if we choose to. And again, I want to be really clear. Within this discussion, we've spoken about, broadly speaking, general community priorities and international reputations. It doesn't reflect all corners and members of our discipline, and there have been many researchers across disciplines who have reported pivoting lots of their activity to better understand things like climate change, including occupational psychologists. It just feels like, to me, we have power, right? We are in an incredibly privileged position, an incredibly privileged profession, and yet we've had a kind of distinct lack of prioritization of these sorts of social issues, protecting vulnerable individuals and society at large. But it's something that we could do, and we could do more of, and we could do better. And so when we look at, why are we not coming up with answers? Because surely if capitalism was in effect, and there was a way of making money from improving things to tackling climate change, then surely that's the way to solve climate change, is to make it fit within capitalism. But we know that actually capitalism provides a lot of strange dynamics for the economic system. So it tends to lead to a small group of the elite holding a disproportionate amount of power and wealth. And it just hasn't led to the sort of effective climate change solutions that perhaps many people think might be possible. A great example of this is carbon offset credits. There's me, like a mug, standing out in a field planting loads of trees. Somebody gives me money, and businesses can claim then that they've done bad things, but they've paid for restoration of wildlife or environment or whatever, so they've got carbon credits they can spend, so they don't have to feel bad about the potential environmental costs of the work they do. This issue is all very well and good, apart from the fact that most of these schemes don't work. They're highly ineffective. Trees don't grow perfectly. They fail to address the underlying issue, which is, in this case, typically fossil fuel consumption. And so there's this incompatibility between capitalism and climate change that's super widely reported. Some great examples of this. Superfast glass. It's a shame nobody's heard of it. So it was a glass that's got a certain chemical bond, which means it's not unbreakable, but essentially you would have to work incredibly hard to break it. If you dropped it on the floor, it would certainly just bounce and you'd be fine. How many times do we knock a glass over, or indeed have my cat with her strong tail knock a glass over, and the glass is broken and I have to buy a new glass, right? Superfast glass would solve that immediately. I'd have one glass in my life. I'd have one pint glass, and that would be all I would ever need to drink water out of, ever. But in fact, superfast glass didn't pick up. People didn't want to buy it, or in fact, organizations didn't want to buy it because they wouldn't then be able to sell their next brand, their next range of glassware. It just didn't work. It was so good, so effective, that nobody wanted it because they couldn't sell replacements. Similar sorts of issues have been, and this tension between capitalism and climate change have been embedded into technology. Now, there have been some movements to try and make technology more repairable, but we all know that there is planned obsolescence within lots of technology. For example, Apple have iPhones or tablets or whatever that their battery use becomes problematic over time, such to an extent that it just, you can't use it until you buy the new one, or it doesn't use the same software updates, so you have to buy the new one so you can still, all these sorts of things. So preventing repairs and planning things to not work in the future means that this, it's a capitalist dream, but it's completely problematic for climate change when we're trying to, for example, encourage reuse, repair, recycle. And when I was doing this, I was trying to think, what good have we as occupational psychologists done to try and tackle climate change and tackle these sorts of issues? And I was sort of a bit stumped. So I'd recommend this book by Jan Maskell, who talks about the kind of role and different contributions that work psychology or Oxpsych can have on the climate crisis. But really, we're at the very start of our journey, and it's my hope that if you think that it is important, that you value these sorts of environmental things or big societal issues, that you will subsequently go on to change your practice to do so. At the moment, this slide I unfortunately leave a little blank, in the hope that maybe you one day will be able to fill it. But let's see where that leads us. A few kind of core recommendations I want to make from this. The first one is that education is super important. How many issues on a big global scale do we say would be cured if education was better? So a great example of that is things like misinformation. People claim if people were better able to navigate different evidence sources and critically evaluate them, then there would be no such thing as misinformation, because people would be able to much better interpret things for themselves. Education is super important within Oxpsych because there's a formal, strict system that individuals must come through to become chartered occupational psychologists. So in the UK, this is set up through the BPS and the HCPC. To date, roughly from about now, occupational psychology courses haven't been required to tackle these sorts of issues. They certainly haven't been encouraged explicitly to talk about climate change within programs and our role as a profession to kind of counter these. I've been very lucky in my role as co-chair of the Division of Occupational Psychology's training committee to revise our standards to be able to say that should be talked about in within the courses that train people to become occupational psychologists. It should be a factor we should be thinking about. And this is really important because in providing examples of our applied work, for example, encouraging placements, work with external organisations, receiving external talks. Our educational experience, when we become socialised, right? We learn about norms, we learn about the kind of informal and hidden curricula. And so when we get people talking about these things, then we start to have that kind of element that it is part of our profession. It is a responsibility of ours to consider that. To date, that's been a bit hidden. It's been certainly contested. And anecdotally, many within the profession report receiving little more than an introduction to the core historical figures of occupational psychology, like I did earlier, more so than any wider understanding of the context we work within or the kind of wider societal factors that we could influence. And so it's my hope that through my developments through the BPS, but also through work like this lecture and the accompanying paper, that we'll be able to start making some of these things a little bit more explicit, more visible, and that those who lack the confidence to have these sorts of discussions can navigate them and help others navigate them and navigate these values as practitioners. That's the hope. I think there's other things that we could do though. Education is important, undoubtedly. I think we also need to start thinking about our values. When I talk to people at the start of the course, so I run an occupational MSc here at Greenwich, and many of the people who start the programme talk about wanting to do good, wanting to help people. And I think subtly over the course of these sorts of informal learning environments and experiences, they come then towards the end of the productivity and effectiveness and supporting managerialist viewpoints. And I think there is an opportunity to better kind of espouse the values of responsibility at all levels, individual and wider, and advocate for individuals and society if we kind of start working in a way that challenges what kind of perpetuates our current value system. When we maintain our guise of being objective, evidence-based practitioners, we place little attention or emphasis on well-being, for example, unless it's financially favourable. We've compromised our values by not advocating for individuals and for society. And so I think for us to maximise our kind of positive social impact, to hold organisations more accountable for the working conditions, the societal implications they have, a change in value system is required to better match our kind of commitments to individuals, yes, to organisations as well, but also to this broader notion of kind of societal well-being. Now, many of you might have heard or understood this discussion within context of the scientist-practitioner model, which helps us recognise the sort of tensions and contradictions between our goal as looking at evidence and doing evidence-based practice and our goal as a practitioner doing the practical. And also the symbiosis between these activities. But some are now arguing, like Lefkowitz, for a scientist-practitioner humanist model to help recognise the potential that we could have in driving substantive societal development, but the requirements of this to challenge current practices and priorities to actually enact that. And this would lead us not to question whether something was evidence-based or likely to be effective, as we would if we were just a scientist, and whether it's cost-effective and appropriate for the environment or whatever, if we were a practitioner, but also whether it was the right thing to do, what implications it would have for others. And that's the kind of humanist component. Embracing our moral and social responsibilities and privileges requires this sort of dramatic shift in our priority. It has to be up there. It has to be really visible. And I always find working collaboratively within networks with similar values is useful to kind of help navigate this sort of space. So, for example, there is a global organization for humanitarian work psychology and a variety of other not OPSYC specific climate groups, for example, that promote these sorts of, or humanist groups that promote these sorts of values and action. In working with and indeed within organisations, I think we have a responsibility to challenge their activities from a moral perspective, reflecting that we believe organisations reflect on how we believe they should be, how they can act. And this requires more than just verbalising our values, but instead acting strongly in their name. And this is quite a controversial thing, unfortunately. For example, not establishing contracts with organisations which clearly do not coalesce with our values. For example, those causing disproportionate environmental harm. You'll never see me work with somebody who's digging oil out of the sea, for example. Not supporting activities which are known to be ineffective and damaging, particularly when it tends to be the ones who pay for it most that are on the lowest levels of privilege. And having those really awkward but sometimes fruitful conversations about the implications of actions and their alignment to our values. Questioning, when, for example, AI is brought up in my university, I ask, well, what is the environmental consequences of that? We need to recognise that organisations are powerful entities, and we have a responsibility to act on the power dynamics within and outside of an organisation when considering if, how, and why we work with them. Lefkowitz has argued in 2008, just because many of us make a living in or from organisations, it does not mean that we cannot advocate for consideration of a broader societal perspective. Well put. And so this leads me to my last of the three actions. So we have education, we have changing our value system, and now I want to encourage and promote collective action. Many domains of OCPSY have been driven by personal, societal beliefs, so things like racism, which has driven psychometric testing. But we need to recognise that our actions, our work, are not value-free or objective. We need a new, more politically engaged type of OCPSY if we want to have the scale of impact that we could have. If we want to make the world a better place, we can do it if we decide to tackle that. Now, whilst for occupational psychology specifically, this may feel a little bit new and uncomfortable, there is a heck of a long history of scientists working to promote change within important societal issues, like, for example, animal cruelty, nuclear weapons. There are plenty of issues, big societal issues to go around, don't all have to pick the same one. Currently, while many researchers report climate action as a priority, and some have made differences within their personal lives, so for example reducing meat and dairy consumption, which is high carbon foods, levels of advocacy and activism in researchers are low. I think lots of people are a bit scared of it. It tends to be a little bit of a charged word. I think these are good things. These are good things that we are acting on our values. And to be honest, given the extent and the speed of action that is required to tackle climate change, advocacy and activism is going to play a critical role in pivoting momentum towards this sort of scale of widespread change that we need. And there are loads of really excellent examples of individuals who have successfully used their domain expertise to promote positive social change. So Rachel Carson is a great example of somebody who challenged the overuse of pesticides and in turn led the development of the modern environmental movement. Really positive change using your scientific expertise to promote that. Now, many researchers think that they have relatively limited autonomy to effectively implement positive change action. And to some extent, that's a fair perception. But we are in really privileged positions. OCPSYs are a privileged group. We are experts in organisational change, in leadership, in training. We can put this to good use. And prioritising and campaigning sustainability in our research and our consultancy work can provide a really important springboard for action within organisations. Maybe even provide us with additional value for ourselves in having evidenced, value-led practice. And that could be really basic. It could be in raising sustainability with clients explicitly, talking about it. It could be adding things, so measuring relevant climate sustainability factors in the research process. Or it could be stopping things, challenging decisions, removing things that had disproportionate climate impact. And indeed, as I mentioned earlier, perhaps even just being selective in what we choose to do and what types of work we go for. Now, I recognise that this type of advocacy work can be resisted, it can be awkward to manage, can lead to negative consequences for the individual. And what I want to emphasise here is this is not an all or nothing position we're in. There are loads of different ways we can engage in advocacy and activism. For example, many OCPSYCs are affiliated to or work within a higher education institute or a university. Universities have pretty large carbon footprints, and we have scope within that to use this sort of space as a training ground to practice our skills, to give it a go before we then start influencing larger scale projects and organisations we work with. And that could be really basic. So a great example is from my own practice, where we were in a panel deciding who should get funding for things like conference travel and covering article processing charges and things like that. And I would bring about, every time we had the conversation that somebody was going to fly, I would bring up the question of, there is a environmental cost to this. Are we considering that in our decision as to whether to give this person money or not to go to do that? Are you traveling, for example, flying all the way to Jamaica when your research has little to no basis in the Jamaican context? And so, are you going for a lovely holiday that you're trying to get paid for by somebody else? When in reality, if we weren't paying for it, you wouldn't either. The goal here was to place climate as a big theme within the conversation, so it was heard, and that led then to introduce within the form for applying for funding a sustainability statement that made a claim that that it wasn't possible to, or it was important despite that impact. It could be all those sorts of things. We could support our student bodies to advocate for plant-based meals as an established catering default. I don't know about you, but the sandwich offerings that we tend to get through catering anyway are pretty sorry. So I'd much prefer a plant-based range than a meat or random fish option. Or in fact, perhaps establishing sustainability as just a critical discussion in common conversations, in the same way that, for example, EDI or equality, diversity and inclusivity is, as a rolling meeting item on the agenda, for example. I think there's loads of little things that we could do. We could use our own organisations as a training ground. Now, some of you may be concerned that activism can undermine your objective scientific reputation, particularly, and obviously I've raised concerns with that as a notion anyway, but particularly when climate change, or whatever your big social issue is, isn't your main area of study. But again, there's been a real long history of scientists doing that, using their reputation, their privilege, their power towards positive social outcomes outside their usual domains of study. So some of you, for example, might not know that Albert Einstein did lots of anti-racist campaigning. Don't really often hear about it, but he did have an impact because of his status. One approach I find might help is to kind of engage with the middle ground. So there has been lots of initiatives. One, for example, was the 1 in 5 project, and this was encouraged. This was established to encourage researchers within any sort of discipline or domain to reflect upon pivoting just a tiny portion of their research to tackling things like climate change or a different social goal, and just introducing these small dimensions of sustainability or climate consideration to research and practice can contribute to a snowballing impact. It can start reinforcing that these are parts of our values. It can reinforce that this is important to share with others, and it becomes part of what we do. Advocacy and activism, both personal and professional. For climate change, it feels like it has to be now or never. It's a priority. But we have the skills to do this. And so now we are left with the choice. What do we do? Or more specifically, what do you want to do? You have an option right now. You've heard obviously a passionate plea on one side of the argument, trying to champion and perhaps challenge the historic trends and discussions within our discipline. But it is time for you to decide, what do you want to do? Would you like more creatures? Or are you here for the creature comforts? And I think it's really important that you, me, and our discipline as a whole, our profession, starts to try and question this. What do we want? Creatures or creature comforts? It's up to you.